My parents used my name like a credit card until the truth blew everything up. So, last spring, on one of those weirdly warm Sundays in Cedar Hills, the kind that tricks you into thinking life might finally calm down, my 9-year-old son Eli collapsed on our kitchen floor. One minute he was drawing spaceships on the back of my grocery list, the next he was curled up, clutching his stomach like someone twisted a knife inside him. And I swear, the moment I saw his face turn that ash-gray color kids shouldn't ever be, something inside me cracked open. I threw my keys in my hoodie, scooped him up, and drove straight to St. Mary's ER like the tires were on fire. I kept telling him, "It's okay, baby, I'm right here," even though the whole time my hands were shaking so hard I could hear my bracelets clinking like tiny alarm bells. While the nurses rushed him to imaging, I stood there in that bleach-smelling hallway, staring at the clock like time was mocking me. And that's when the doctor said the words no parent ever wants to hear. "We need to take him to surgery, immediately." My ears started ringing. My brain just fogged. I did the only thing I could think to do. I texted my family group chat. Nothing dramatic, just facts. "Eli's being taken in for emergency surgery. I'm at St. Mary's. I might need help today." Now you'd think a message like that would stir at least a flicker of concern, right? A call, a question, hell, even a thumbs up just to show someone saw it. But all I got were 3 little delivered check marks sitting there like tombstones. No follow-up, no, "we're coming," not even, "keep us posted." Just silence, so thick it felt like it pressed against my chest. Here's the thing about my family. I grew up always being the reliable one, the quiet helper who never caused trouble. Middle child syndrome mixed with Midwest politeness. I guess that's how I ended up being the person who always lent money when someone's car battery died, or someone's temporary setback lasted 3 years. And somehow that morphed into me sending a monthly contribution to help the family stay afloat, as my mom liked to put it. I used to think I was doing the right thing, that I was keeping us together. But standing in that cold hospital hallway, watching the nurses wheel my baby behind those double doors, I realized I was the only one holding on to that idea. The longer the silence went on, the heavier it felt. I kept checking my phone every few minutes like maybe I missed a call, maybe they'd respond eventually. But nothing. My dad runs a lawn equipment shop just 10 minutes from the hospital. My mom lives even closer. My younger sister posts a selfie every 4 hours like clockwork, so it wasn't like they were off the grid. They just didn't care enough to show up. I guess the thing I didn't expect was how unsurprised I felt. Hurt, sure, but not shocked. It's amazing how numb you can get to being treated like an afterthought. When they took Eli into the OR, I paced the lobby like a ghost. There were 3 other families waiting, whispering, clutching hands, crying into each other's shoulders. Watching them felt like staring through a window into a life I'd never had. I kept thinking, if something happens to me, who shows up for Eli? And that thought, it sat in my gut like a stone. Then my phone buzzed. My heart jumped so hard I almost dropped it. But nope, it wasn't my mom or dad. It wasn't my sister. It was a notification from the utility company reminding me my bill was due on Tuesday. I actually laughed under my breath, this sad, bitter sound I didn't recognize. The world keeps spinning, right? I finally sat down because my knees wouldn't cooperate anymore. I kept replaying memories of my family, barbecues where I cooked everything while they sat around complaining, holidays where they forgot to buy Eli a single present, birthdays where they forgot the date, and all the times I'd made excuses for them. They're just busy. They didn't mean it. It's fine. But that afternoon, in that stiff plastic chair under the humming fluorescent lights, it finally hit me. If love doesn't show up when you need it most, what is it worth? About an hour into waiting, when the clock seemed frozen and the smell of burnt coffee was making me nauseous, someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around, expecting a nurse. Instead, it was my Aunt Marcy. And I swear, seeing her standing there in her mismatched scarf and paint-splattered denim jacket almost made my knees buckle. I hadn't even called her. She told me she saw my text in the family chat, Not because anyone responded, but because she checks it sometimes, just to make sure you're still surviving them. She sat next to me without asking, placed a warm thermos in my hands and said, "Drink this before you pass out, kid." She always calls me kid, even though I'm 34. And just like that, I felt something unclench in my chest. Someone came. Someone showed up for me without needing a reason. I told her about the surgery, about how fast everything happened, and somewhere in the middle of my rambling, I realized she wasn't shocked by my family's absence. She just sighed and said softly, "They've taken advantage of your kindness for years, Claire. Maybe today is the day you finally see it." And I don't know why, but those words hit harder than the doctor telling me they were cutting into my child. Maybe because a part of me had known it forever and just didn't want to admit it. I leaned my head against the wall and whispered, "I just thought they'd care more." Marcy reached over, squeezed my hand and replied, "Sweetheart, some people only value the things they can take from you. Once they can't take any more, they vanish." I didn't know then that this was just the beginning, that the silence from my family wasn't indifference, it was a warning, a sign of the storm that was coming, a storm I didn't start, but would eventually have to end. After what felt like an entire lifetime, the surgeon finally came out and gave us the update. Eli made it through the procedure, and they were moving him to recovery. I swear my knees almost buckled with relief. I didn't cry, though. I never do. It's like my body refuses to fall apart in public, even when everything inside me feels like it's unraveling. Marcy just put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Told you that kid's got fire in him," in that warm, raspy voice of hers that always sounds like she's 2 seconds from laughing, even when she's worried sick. There's something grounding about her, like she's lived through enough storms to know which ones matter and which ones don't. We followed the nurse to this small, dimly lit recovery room where machines beeped steadily, almost gently, as if trying not to disturb the kids sleeping in there. Eli looked tiny in that hospital bed, tubes taped to his arm, cheeks pale under the fluorescent glow. And something about watching him sleep, peaceful but fragile, made all the noise in my head go quiet. For a minute it was just me, my son, and the steady rhythm of him fighting his way back to us. Marcy pulled a chair up next to me and handed me a protein bar from her giant canvas tote. She always carries it around like some sort of chaotic Mary Poppins. I didn't even open it, just held it in my hand like it was proof someone remembered I existed. "You need to eat," she said. "You look like a stiff breeze could knock you over." I muttered something about being fine, but she ignored me the way people do when they know you're lying. For the first half hour, it was quiet. Not awkward quiet, just the kind that settles on you after a day you didn't think you'd survive. I caught Marcy watching me a couple times, her brow furrowed like she was thinking about something she wasn't sure she should say. Eventually, she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Claire, honey, how long have you been the family ATM?" I almost choked. "The what?" "The ATM. Money goes out, nothing comes in. You know, those machines at gas stations everyone pretends they don't see unless they need something." I wanted to laugh because that's exactly what it felt like, but the truth stung too much. I told her about the monthly contribution I'd been sending my parents, how it started after Dad's knee surgery years ago. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few months to help them cover bills. Then it somehow morphed into something permanent. I'd tried bringing it up once, gently, but Mom shut me down with this guilt-laced line about family supporting family. And since I'm the one who made poor life choices and ended up a single mom, I guess paying extra was supposed to be my penance. Marcy let out a low whistle. "They've been bleeding you dry, kid." The worst part? Hearing it out loud made me realize I'd known that for a long time. I just didn't want to admit it. Growing up in a small Midwest town like ours, loyalty gets twisted into something that feels like a weight around your ankle. You don't speak up because it's family. You don't question things because everyone will say you're ungrateful. You don't set boundaries because, well, boundaries are for people who weren't raised to apologize for taking up space. But sitting in that hospital room, looking at my son and thinking about all the things I'd given up to keep my parents comfortable, I suddenly felt sick. Not because of the money, though trust me, it wasn't pocket change, but because of how little they gave back. I mean, I said quietly, I just kinda thought they'd care more today, or at least fake it. That's the thing about people who only come around when they need something, Marcy said. They don't know how to show up when it matters. It's not part of the deal. She said that with such certainty it made my stomach twist. Like she'd been waiting years for me to ask the question I'd been afraid to even think. She rummaged around in her tote again, pulled out a worn manila folder, and dropped it onto her lap with a thud. And since we're finally talking about this, I think you need to see something. I blinked at her. What is that? Paperwork. Stuff I found when I was over at your parents' house last week helping your mom with her holiday boxes. She left this in the laundry room. And before you say anything, I wasn't snooping. Your mother just has a talent for leaving important documents next to the dog food. She flipped the folder open, and even from across the room I could see half a dozen envelopes with my name scribbled on them. You might want to brace yourself. I didn't touch them. I wasn't ready. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know. But she gave me this soft, sad smile, like she'd watched this pattern for too long and said, Claire, they've been using your credit to cover their mess for years, and they're gearing up to put more in your name. I felt the ground drop out beneath me. Are you serious? I wish to God I wasn't. She didn't push me to read anything, just laid out the facts in that calm, steady tone of hers that somehow made everything scarier. There were past due notices, letters from some debt consolidation firm, and one envelope with handwriting I recognized instantly, my mother's cursive, the kind she reserves for things she wants you to feel guilty about. I didn't open that one either, not yet. Instead, I stared at the wall and tried to keep my breathing steady. And the whole time Eli slept, oblivious to the storm building above his head. My heart ached watching him. Kids don't get to choose their families. They're just handed the ones we have, with all the brokenness baked in. After a long stretch of silence, Marcy said gently, I know this is a lot, but look where you are right now. Your son's in a hospital bed, and they still didn't show up. Not even a text. Don't you think that tells you everything you need to know? It did. It told me more than I wanted to hear. It told me that the people I'd been protecting my whole life wouldn't cross the street for me if I were on fire. Somewhere down the hall, a vending machine clunked and whirred. Someone muttered about their granola bar getting stuck. And I sat there, staring at the little rise and fall of Eli's chest, wondering how I'd been so blind for so long. But the thing about truths like this is that once you see them, really see them, you can't unsee them. They sit heavy, they change you, they force your hand. And that night, in the quiet hum of the pediatric recovery wing, I felt something shift inside me. Not a dramatic epiphany, more like this slow, steady flame that started at the base of my spine and warmed its way up. A flame made of anger, exhaustion, and a kind of resolve I didn't know I was capable of. Because if my family wasn't going to show up for me, fine, I'd show up for myself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. 3 days after Eli was discharged, when I finally let myself believe we were out of the woods, everything went sideways. It was one of those quiet mornings where the house still smelled faintly like hospital soap because I'd been wiping down every surface like a maniac. Marcy was in the kitchen humming something old school while stirring oatmeal, and Eli was on the couch, crayons spread out everywhere like he was planning the next Picasso masterpiece. It felt peaceful, dangerously peaceful, the kind of calm that tricks you into thinking maybe life finally decided to stop throwing punches. Then the doorbell rang. Not a normal ring. Not the quick Amazon package ding or the friendly triple tap my neighbor does. No, this was a long, deliberate press, followed by another one, and another, like someone out there was rehearsing their entrance. I already knew. I swear my stomach recognized that knock before my brain caught up. I opened the door, and there they were, my parents, standing like two statues carved out of disappointment and judgment. Mom had on her church Sunday coat, even though it was a Wednesday. Dad's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like he hadn't unclenched it since the Reagan administration. And the first thing out of Mom's mouth wasn't, "How's Eli?" or, "Are you okay?" It was, "We need to have a serious conversation." Right. Because nothing screams family emergency like showing up unannounced the week your grandson had surgery. I didn't invite them in. I just stepped aside because my Midwest upbringing is coded deep into my DNA and apparently overrides common sense. They walked in like they owned the place, eyes scanning my living room like it was a crime scene they were solving. Marcy appeared in the doorway holding her mug like it was a weapon she'd gladly use. The tension in the room thickened instantly. My mom's smile dropped when she saw her. "Oh, you're here," she said, the kind of passive-aggressive tone that would melt glass. Marcy didn't blink. "Yep," she said cheerfully. "Still here? Still inconvenient for you, I guess." Dad pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and slapped it onto the dining table. "This needs to be discussed now." I didn't even sit down. "What is it?" "Your responsibility," he said. "Your financial responsibility." I blinked. "For what?" "For your brother," Mom snapped, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "He can't keep up with all the bills, Claire. The interest rates, the property taxes, everything is going up and you're just letting him drown." I stared at them, genuinely stunned. "You do realize my child just had surgery, right? That I was in a hospital room for days, alone, without a single call from either of you?" Mom waved a hand like swatting at a fly. "We were busy, you know that. Busy. Busy at brunch. Busy at wine-tasting weekends. Busy everywhere except where a family should be." Dad tapped the paper again. "You agreed to help. You can't just decide to stop." "I didn't agree," I said slowly. "You told me, and I went along with it because I didn't know better yet." Mom narrowed her eyes. "This attitude is exactly why nobody in the family takes you seriously." "Oh, so that's what today was. Not a conversation. Not concern. Just another performance of the Claire is the problem show." But then Marcy stepped forward, calm as a monk, and placed a neatly organized stack of documents on top of Dad's paper. "Funny thing," she said. "We did some digging." Dad stiffened, Mom paled. They knew exactly what that meant. I slid the top document toward me. It was from a credit bureau. My name was listed on things I'd never heard of. Lines of credit, a store account for furniture I'd never seen, a refinancing form with a signature suspiciously similar to mine, but not quite. For a moment, I genuinely forgot how to breathe. "You forged my name?" I whispered. Dad crossed his arms. "We didn't forge anything. We simply used the access you gave us years ago." "An access I revoked," I said, my voice shaking. "And you still used it." "That's enough, Claire," Mom snapped. "Stop acting like a victim. Families help each other. You're making this uglier than it needs to be." "No," Marcy said, her voice low and sharp enough to cut steel. "They made it ugly when they dragged her credit into their mess. When they hid foreclosure notices. When they ignored her son's surgery, but somehow found the time to ask for more money." Dad turned red. "You need to stay out of this, Marcy. This is family business." Marcy leaned in slightly. "Then why did you use Claire as your personal cash dispenser? Why did you gamble with her future without telling her? Why did you try to scare her into paying debts she doesn't legally or morally owe?" The room went silent, completely still. It felt like the moment before a tornado drops from the sky. Dad finally spoke. "Claire, we raised you. We sacrificed for you. The least you can do is support us when things get tough." I laughed. Not because it was funny. The kind of laugh that cracks through shock like a thin sheet of ice breaking underfoot. "Support you?" I said. "I've been supporting you my entire adult life, and you didn't even care enough to show up when Eli was on an operating table." Mom crossed her arms, chin lifted. "You think one surgery excuses how you've treated us recently?" "One surgery?" I said louder. "He almost died, and you're worried about mortgage payments?" They didn't respond. Not because they didn't have an answer, but because they didn't like the answer. Then something clicked in my chest. This solid, calm certainty I didn't know I was capable of. I picked up the paper Dad brought, tore it clean down the middle, and dropped it onto the table like it was nothing more than a grocery receipt. Dad's face went crimson. Mom gasped like I'd slapped her. "No more," I said. "No more guilt, no more payments, no more pretending this is my responsibility. If your world is falling apart, that's on you, not me." Mom's voice trembled with rage. "You're ungrateful." "Maybe," I said softly, "but I'm finally free." For the first time in my life, they looked small. Not weak, not defeated, just exposed. Like two people who'd been running a con so long they forgot there would be a bill eventually. They left without another word. When the door closed, my whole body sagged. Marcy stepped beside me and just breathed with me. No lectures, no sympathy speeches, just quiet, the kind that feels like someone holding your hand without touching you. Eli peeked around the corner with big, sleepy eyes. "Mom, everything okay?" I scooped him up and kissed his hair. "Yeah, buddy, everything's gonna be okay." Because for the first time ever, the storm wasn't inside the house anymore. It was outside, where it belonged. I thought the house would feel lighter after my parents walked out that day, like some giant weight had been pried off my chest. And in a way, it did. But the weird part about cutting ties with toxic people is the silence that comes after. It's never peaceful. It's charged. Like when a tornado passes, and you stand there waiting to see what's left standing. The first 48 hours were quiet enough to make me uneasy. No calls, no passive-aggressive texts, no guilt-coded voicemails from Mom. Nothing. Just dead air. Honestly, it made my skin crawl. When people like my parents go quiet, it's never because they learned a lesson. It's because they're calculating their next move. But instead of obsessively checking my phone like I usually do, I tried something different. I focused on my home, on Eli, on breathing. I let the new quiet stretch across the house like a blanket I wasn't sure how to use yet. That first night, after putting Eli to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that tasted like cardboard because I was too tired to brew it properly. Marcy sat across from me, flipping through her old-school planner. You know, the paper kind with dozens of sticky tabs. Because she swears phones are untrustworthy when it comes to important things. She looked up at me and said, almost casually, "You know, you don't have to go back to the way things were." I shrugged. "I don't even know what that means." "It means this," she said, tapping her pen on the table. "You have a chance to redraw the entire map. You can choose who gets access and who doesn't. You can choose the life you want instead of the one they shoved you into." I didn't answer. I just stared at my chipped mug like it was going to tell me the future. But her words sat with me. Heavy. True. The next day, things started shifting in ways I didn't expect. First was the voicemail from my brother's wife, Julie. Her voice was thin, trembling, trying so hard to sound calm that it was painful to listen to. She didn't yell. She didn't guilt-trip me. She just said, "We're in trouble, Claire. We might lose the house." And then she hung up before I could even think of responding. An hour later, Dad left a voicemail too. This one was different from his usual disappointed father performance. He sounded exhausted, older, like the last few weeks had scraped something out of him. He didn't apologize. He would rather swallow a cactus whole than apologize. But he murmured, "Your brother made mistakes. We all did. We never meant for it to fall on you like this." I listened to that one twice. Not because I wanted to, but because for the first time, I heard something cracked in his voice. Something human. Still didn't respond, though. Then came the real curveball. A letter in the mail addressed to me, written in Mom's cursive, the one she uses on holiday cards. I didn't open it right away. I almost threw it out, honestly. But something made me keep it sitting on the counter for hours, like some kind of emotional landmine I wasn't ready to step on. While all that was hanging in the background, life inside my house started to bloom a little. Eli was getting stronger. His cheeks had color again. He followed Marcy around like a little duckling carrying his sketchbook, and she, being Marcy, encouraged every chaotic scribble like it was a mini modern art masterpiece. I'd catch her saying things like, "Oh my goodness, buddy, Picasso wishes he had these lines," and Eli would beam like he'd won the Pulitzer. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found the two of them building a blanket fort so ridiculous it took up half the space. And something in me softened. Not the fragile kind of softness. The kind that feels like you're thawing out after being frozen for too long. Watching them together, I realized I'd been carrying my whole world alone for so long I forgot what it felt like to have someone else share the weight. That night, after Eli fell asleep inside the fort, because Marcy insisted it had structural integrity, she sat next to me on the couch and asked, "So, what are you going to do with that letter?" I sighed so hard it felt like I aged 10 years. "I don't know, maybe nothing." "You're allowed to want answers," she said. "You're also allowed to protect your peace. Either choice is valid." Protect my peace. A sentence that felt foreign, like she'd said it in another language. The following morning, I finally opened the letter. It wasn't an apology. I didn't expect one. But it wasn't a guilt bomb either. It was something worse. A justification. A neat, handwritten explanation about how family sacrifices for each other, and how they never would have asked if they had any other choice, and how I've changed lately, and it scares them. I almost laughed. Changed lately? Lady, I changed the day I realized my son and I deserved better than being their emotional and financial supply chain. But the part that punched me in the gut was when she wrote, "Your father feels like he's losing his daughter." I closed the letter, folded it in half, and put it back in the envelope without saying a word. That night, Jonah, the neighbor from 2 houses down, dropped by with a casserole he admitted he bought from Whole Foods because he can't cook for the life of him. He's this divorced IT guy in his 40s who always waves when he sees us in the yard, but never lingers long enough to make it awkward. He asked about Eli, asked if we needed anything, and left without probing. People like that, people who show up quietly, without asking for anything in return, are the ones who stick with you, the ones you remember. The days rolled by, and slowly, the storm outside my house wasn't mine anymore. My brother sent 3 more messages, each one more desperate than the last. My parents tried calling from different numbers. Even my aunt from out west reached out, asking if I'd be the bigger person. But something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't undo, even if I wanted to. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't seeking revenge, I just finally saw the whole picture, and once you see it you can't pretend you didn't. One evening, while watching Eli draw on the floor, Marcy looked at me and said, "You know what the hardest part of healing is? Realizing some people don't get to come with you." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth of it sat between us like a quiet, steady heartbeat. By the end of that week, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Real grounded control. Not the desperate, scrambling kind I used to mistake for strength. I wasn't sure what the future would look like now that the old map was gone. But for the first time, the blank space didn't scare me. It felt like possibility. A couple weeks after everything went down, life settled into this strange, soft rhythm I barely recognized. Not perfect, not magical, just steady. And for someone who grew up constantly bracing for the next explosion, emotional, financial, or whatever, that steadiness felt like a luxury I didn't know how to hold at first. Some mornings I'd still wake up with that old knot in my stomach, expecting a crisis waiting outside the bedroom door. But then I'd step into the hallway and hear Eli humming while brushing his teeth, or smell Marcy's burned toast. She burns it every single time. It's honestly a talent. And I'd remember, the crisis isn't here anymore. It never belonged to this house. It was something I carried in, and something I finally had the courage to put down. One Sunday, we took Eli to the park down by Lake Marion. The air was crisp enough to sting your nose, and kids were running everywhere like tiny meteorites. Eli was finally strong enough to climb the small rock wall again, and the way he beamed when he reached the top, arms raised like he was king of the county, made something warm bloom in my chest. I hadn't seen him that confident in months, maybe years. And as I watched him, I realized the storm we'd just survived didn't just break things. It cleared space for new things to grow. While he played, Marcy and I sat on a picnic bench sipping terrible gas station coffee because we forgot to brew some before leaving the house. She nudged me with her shoulder and said, "You look lighter." I laughed. "I'm just tired." "No," she said, shaking her head. "There's tired. And then there's finally breathing again. You're doing the second one." And she was right. I was. For the first time, I felt like my lungs knew how to take a full breath. Later that afternoon, while Eli fed ducks from the shoreline, my phone buzzed. An email from my dad. Short, formal, almost cold, which is funny considering he thinks I'm the cold one. He said he accepted that I needed space, that they'd handle their situation independently. He didn't ask for money, didn't demand forgiveness, didn't try to spin the story, just said they hoped, in time, the door might open again. I stared at that line for a long time. The old me would have melted, apologized, rushed to fix everything like I always did. But now, I just felt grounded, not angry, not bitter, just clear. Later, when we got home, I read the email to Marcy while she chopped vegetables for dinner. She didn't say what she thought right away. She just kept chopping, then finally asked, "So, how do you feel about it?" I shrugged. "Strange, grateful maybe, sad a little, but mostly steady." "Steady's good," she said. "Steady is underrated." That night after dinner, when Eli was asleep, I sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, thinking about how everything started. About the version of me who let everyone else's needs swallow her whole. The version who believed love meant sacrifice, even when the sacrifice was myself. The version who thought being the bigger person was some moral obligation instead of a choice. I don't hate that version. She did the best she could with what she knew. But she's not the one steering anymore. There was this moment, I can't even explain why it hit so hard, where I looked at Eli sleeping, tiny chest rising and falling, and I thought, he's learning from me. Every single thing I do teaches him how to treat himself. And that thought was like a quiet, powerful punch to the heart. If he grows up thinking he has to break himself just to keep others comfortable, that would be on me. And I refused to pass that torch along. A few days later, I ran into Jonah again, the neighbor who brought the Whole Foods casserole. He was walking his dog, Baxter, who is 70 pounds of chaos wrapped in fur. We talked for a bit, nothing deep, just neighbor stuff. But before I left, he said, "Hey, for what it's worth, I've seen you doing this on your own for a long time. And I'm glad you finally set some boundaries. It suits you." So, it was such a simple comment, but it sank in deeper than he probably meant it to. People notice, even when you think they don't. Something else happened that week too. Unexpected but soft in its own way. My aunt, the only person on that side of the family who ever treated me like more than a utility, called. Not to guilt me, not to recruit me into fixing whatever chaos my parents created. She just said she was proud of me. Proud that I didn't let them pull me back in. Proud that I chose my son and myself. I didn't cry, but I came close. And that's the funny thing about healing. Sometimes it doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it's in the quiet phone calls, the neighbor's passing comment, the way your kid laughs a little louder, or the way you sleep a little deeper. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses and the sky turned that impossible mix of lavender and pale gold, I sat in the backyard with a blanket around my shoulders. Marcy joined me with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, hers loaded with whipped cream like a 5-year-old's, and she handed me mine with a soft smile. "So, what now?" she asked. I thought about it. About everything that had been taken, everything I'd given away, everything I'd reclaimed. And then I said, I think, now we build something better. Something that belongs to us. She clinked her mug against mine. To better, I echoed. And in that moment, with the chill in the air and the warm mug between my hands, I felt something settle inside me, something quiet and deep and certain. And the world wasn't perfect, my family wasn't fixed, my past wasn't erased, but none of it had the same power over me anymore. What I carried now was different, stronger, softer, mine. And as weird as it sounds, I wasn't angry, I wasn't mourning, I wasn't even hoping for some big dramatic redemption arc. I just felt ready to move forward. Ready to protect the peace I fought so hard for. Ready to teach my son what it looks like when someone chooses themselves without shame. Ready to build a life defined not by obligation, but by clarity, honesty, and love that actually feels like love. If there's anything this whole mess taught me, it's this. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones nobody sees. And sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that change everything. Looking back on everything, I think the real turning point wasn't the fight, or the confrontation, or even the moment I finally said no. It was the quiet realization that I'd spent years shrinking myself just to make other people comfortable. I used to believe loyalty meant carrying other people's burdens, no matter how heavy they were, even when they weren't mine to carry. But life has a way of teaching you the same lesson over and over until you finally understand it. You can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. And honestly, that truth hurt. Until it didn't. If this whole mess taught me anything, it's that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors. You get to choose who walks through, who stays, and who no longer has a key. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that love, real love, shouldn't feel like obligation, fear, or guilt. It should feel steady, safe, honest, and it should leave enough room for you to breathe. I learned that breaking cycles doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as finally telling the truth out loud, even if your voice shakes. Sometimes it's choosing peace over permission. Sometimes it's remembering that what you tolerate becomes your standard, and deciding you deserve better. Weeks later, they reached out again, this time softer, quieter, carrying words I never thought I'd hear. And I forgave them, but this time on my terms. If this story hit something inside you, share your thoughts below. Tell me what part stayed with you, or share your own story if you're ready. Hit like if this resonated, and subscribe if you want more stories that cut deep, heal slow, and remind us we're stronger than we think. Wishing you gentleness, clarity, and the kind of peace that stays, even after the storm.